Rodemos el Diálogo o Embrace Dialogue. The university and Embrace Dialogue share similar principles. One of the university's principles is social justice. The university strives to make a difference in the world by working with local and global organizations. Embrace Dialogue. The university and Embrace Dialogue share similar principles. The center is an example of the focus of the international work of the university in peace and reconciliation and the fight for integrity and justice in a world of compromises and prejudice. And therefore, we believe in this partnership with Embrace Dialogue. Embrace Dialogue, peace-building efforts in Colombia range from a huge variety, supporting transitional justice, supporting DDR or disarmament, reintegration of combatants, doing peace education and supporting the role of youth in peace building. And we will learn about this work a bit more in this dialogue. And Rodemos el Diálogo follows 6 principles. And the principles are generosity, which means to put in motion our ethical drive, solidarity, in order to understand the needs of others in an interconnected world, co-responsibility, in order to do bridge building between academics and practitioners, honesty, in order to try to find the evidence base of the good efforts of peace building, respect, in order to overcome and recognize also our cognitive bias and the possibilities of building a horizontal space, and self-criticism as a way of being self-reflective and to promote appreciative inquiry. We invite you all to embrace these principles in this critical dialogue on reconciliation today. And without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker of this dialogue, Camilo Villarreal. Camilo is a law and political science student from the Javeriana University in Bogotá. He is a peace activist, is member of Rodemos el Diálogo since 2016, currently works on issues of transitional justice and reconciliation. He's been coordinator of the youth group of Embrace Dialogue and has been involved in oversight of the implementation of the peace accord, as well as youth mobilization following the 2016 peace referendum. Camilo is one of the co-authors of Hacer Historia, or ToBeHistory, the book at the core of our conversation today. So let me just tell you a bit of how we are going to do this. This video is being live streamed and people might be watching it on YouTube. So for the people who are watching at this, they can ask questions through YouTube, or they can ask questions also on the chat here in this space. What we're going to do first is to explore a dialogue with Camilo between him and me for the next 30 minutes or so. And then we are going to open the floor to try to answer some of those questions that might come through the chat and through the different channels in which this has been promoted. The idea, of course, is that this dialogue, first part of the dialogue with Camilo, gives you some ideas, some thoughts, some reflections for further questions that you would like to ask, to put on the floor in order for us to try to build together a flow of meaning of what does it mean to work on reconciliation with the experience that Camilo is going to share with us. And after we have answered your questions, we will then go to the end of this critical dialogue and reconciliation, and I will do a final wrap up, and then we will leave it there. So probably this space is going to last for maximum an hour and a half. So with that in mind, Camilo, let's turn to you. Why don't you tell us a bit about this project called ToBeHistory? how it came about, why is it called like that? What is this that you have been doing for the last few years?
Thank you, Andre. It's such a huge honor to be here in my home, that is Rodemos el Diálogo, and the University of Winchester. Before I answer your question, just want to say one thing regarding the way I'll try to explain what has happened, because it's a lot of dialogues we've had. I'm not sure if you've seen The Good Place, a TV series, and one of the people in that TV series ends up going to hell because of name dropping. So in order to avoid that consequence, I will not say names, and every anecdote I will tell will just be to explain whatever point I'm doing, with no intention of trying to for people to remember the anecdotes. There's no need to. So about ToBeHistory, hacer historia. It's actually a wordplay between hacer, as in make, and ser, as in be. And we were thinking about what we want to do. We had been in Red Youth for already 2 years, maybe, with Oriana, and well, at that time it was basically Oriana and I, and then other people joined, but we were planning what we can do. And at that point, the Truth Commission started its mandate. And it became absolutely evident that we had a pending conversation about what had happened in Colombia throughout our history of horrible violence. But it was something that wasn't really talked about that much. We talked a lot about peace building. We talked a lot about the peace agreement, but we found that young people weren't that engaged in actually speaking about what the truth of our armed conflict was. So we designed, Oriana and I, this idea of let's bring victims and perpetrators, or former combatants, to speak to young people about what happened in Colombia throughout its history. We were absolutely amazed at the interest other young people had by the project. At the end of the project, we had 30 encounters, about 20 of them with victims and 10 of them with former combatants, that had involved 150 young people, 150 individual young people who had been, who were interested in understanding what happened. And basically what we did was ask them to tell us their story, ask them to tell us what they had lived, who they are, which is a question that they very rarely get asked, who they are, and what they've done to build peace amidst a continuing violence. And many of them had started peace building initiatives far from the signing of the agreement, 20 years before the agreement, or 30 years before the agreement. So that's basically what we did. From that, we published a book called Hacer Historia, in which we reflect upon all those encounters we had and try to explain to ourselves the impact that war had in our society, and the impact it had in our lives on many ways. The lack of trust, the ways it hurt democracy, the ways that war stigmatized youth, which we see even today in the protests that have happened around the country, the way in which the war that many of us always saw as something very far away that happened in the rural areas actually also happened in Bogota, with very deep effects on the way our state works and our society works. So in that book, we reflect upon all of those encounters and dialogues we had, the dialogues, of course, with our guests to the dialogue spaces, but also our dialogues amongst ourselves to understand, well, what happened to us in such a long armed confrontation. So that's basically what the project was. Um, we met some amazing people. We met victims from state terrorism, such as the victims of the Patriotic Union party that was exterminated throughout 20 years of its existence. We met with victims of kidnapping, which was very important for us because we had grown up with the images of the FARC kidnaps. We spoke to the person who was the last commander of FARC. We spoke to paramilitary, we spoke to military. We really tried to speak to everyone and get a big picture about what happened in our country throughout the last at least 30 or 40 years.
Great, Camilo. That sounds fantastic. I'm gonna ask you a question that is quite simple, but I think it's important for the people who don't know Probemos el Diálogo that well. You've mentioned Oriana twice, and you said Oriana and myself. Well, we know who you are. Who is Oriana?
Well, Oriana is it was my co-coordinator, but at the time I was coordinating the youth left that role. But she's basically the person I built the project with, and was the first person I was actually able to convince about this. The first of the other 150 people who was actually convinced about this idea being possible. So yeah,
okay, and so
yeah.
If she's an example of these people, why don't you tell us a bit more about, I mean, in general, features of who were the other people who joined these conversations? Were they students? What were they studying? Where were they living? I guess this also happened in the middle of the lockdown of the pandemic. And so what was the impact of that? Why don't you tell us a bit more about these sort of things?
Great question. One of the things that characterizes a Colombian society is very class divided, hugely class divided. The neighborhoods are very homogeneous in many ways. That you hear a lot about the good places of town and the bad places of town. And so when we started, part of why Oriana is particularly important is because I study in a private university, in a Jesuit university. She studies in a public university. I graduated from a British private high school. She graduated from a public high school. So when we started bringing our contacts together, we started having a really diverse and unique group of young people that studied everything from, of course, political science, sociology, law, anthropology, up to engineering and arts and medicine. We had people from private universities, from the elite universities of Bogota. We had people from the public universities and people who had to ask for help in order to transport themselves to the meetings and back home. And again, as we saw this diverse group, and this is before the pandemic, I'll go into what happened with the pandemic in a second. Before this, we started realizing that we actually had consequences of war, even when none of us had lived, well, most of us hadn't lived war directly. And we started talking about our families and the way that our families had lived war in many different ways, because we had, of course, the people who were much more wealthy, who had been really frightened by the kidnappings of FARC, like extortive kidnappings FARC did 20 years ago, and then the people whose families had come forcibly displaced by all sorts of armed groups into the city from from the rural areas of our country. So we started, and then with the pandemic, Zoom became our lifestyle for all of us, I'm sure. And we had the huge privilege of speaking to Commissioner Angela Salazar, Truth Commissioner Angela Salazar. And when she accepted our invitation, she put one condition, and was that we invite all the other youth networks, as these were now virtual conversations, we could invite all the other youth networks allied to the Truth Commission, which are all around the country and are very diverse, from very militant, for example, communist groups that are very interested in understanding the impact of war to the Communist Party in the regions, all the other way to also very diverse group of other cities who were very alike to us. And so we invited them to our conversations, and we started to build a very strong coalition from all around the country who was interested in speaking about these topics, about truth, about violence, about memory, about transitional justice, reconciliation, reparations, all that sort of stuff. So at the end of the project and beginning new projects, we had now a group that was from all sorts of disciplines, from, as I told you, from the social sciences that are most likely to involve in this sort of project, up to people who weren't even studying in university, who were from rural areas that were interested in keeping the rural lifestyle, were not studying. And we had people from all around the country. We had, for the first time, we had people from different ethnicities, which in Bogota is still hard to get. People who had lived the war directly, which again, most of us in Bogota had not, and who had much more strong experiences because they had coexisted with the armed groups in the regions. So all of that was absolutely amazing in understanding the conflict in a much more diverse way than we did previously.
Camilo, this sounds a fantastic experience. You start with a small group of people, you start two people talking about, what has happened in their lives. You convince Oriana, then you two go and meet other students. You convince these students, or they start sharing the experience of their families. They get enthusiastic about it. Then you manage to just go from in-person to online, and then suddenly you have a project that spreads out across the country. Now, I guess there are two questions that come to mind here. The first one is, how did you manage to finance this? I mean, you said that there were people who you had to pay the transport to get to the places. So again, did you have a specific partnership? Was that an obstacle that you have to overcome? I mean, usually you'd have fantastic ideas, but to transform them into reality takes, how did you overcome that? And if that was a first obstacle? And then I ask you the second question after that.
Okay, so the first moment I actually suffered for money in my life was trying to build this project, because at the beginning we come to the direction, to you and Beatriz Bejarano, who was directing at the time, with this massive idea which we thought was brilliant, and being 18-year-olds, we had no conscience of limited resources, and of course the first question you ask is, okay, then how much does it cost? And the first what we expected it to cost at first, we gave it to you, you gave it back to us, and that was nonsense, and then back again, and then it was some money that we had to recollect. We had the huge, one of the principles of Embrace Dialogue is solidarity, and not generosity, actually. And we had of course, we tend to, in Embrace Dialogue, we tend to separate generosity just from giving materially, but we did have the huge generosity of the members of Embrace Dialogue at first. We had the generosity of the University of Bristol, who also supported us as part of a bigger project regarding memories from the margins that they worked with us. And then we've had always the cooperation. At one point, we tried to sell avocados. That absolutely didn't work. We ended up buying the avocados ourselves after they were basically ruined. So yes, that was a huge obstacle. That's still a huge obstacle as we look forward to doing new things. However, I think we've always counted on the kindness of so many people that are interested in this sort of things happening for that.
Okay, thanks, Camilo. The other question that comes to mind for people to understand is you have mentioned that, again, this was led by the youth, by a group of young people. But to put together a project, to design a methodology, to get in touch with people like a truth commissioner, so someone who is so important as a truth commissioner, I guess you need some support. So could you really tell us, I mean, did you have all the freedom and you were really left on your own? Or was it more like there was some support? To what degree you would say that there was some support to you, but that it was really led by you? And how important was that you were the ones who had to overcome those obstacles and that you didn't have other people trying to solve your own problems?
Okay, so in Colombia, in Brazil, Colombia, they say I'm a phone book, because with time I have recollected lots of contacts of different people, and they tend to ask me, well, how you do that? Like, who are your connections? Who's in your family that's able to, and or what have you of extraordinary that makes it so easy for you to get contacts? And to start with the contacts, I think that most of the people we worked with had at least as strong a conviction as we did of the importance of this. And it is not even a conviction that any of us transmitted to them. It was a personal conviction that peace could only be reached through youth involvement. So when we spoke to the Truth Commissioner Angela Salazar, we met her at the Commission's office, and we spoke to her maybe 5 minutes at a memorial for another commissioner who had also passed away. And she immediately gave us her phone number because she believed it was important. When we went for the guests and we tried to find them, we WhatsApp them or emailed them, and they all said, I'm joining because it is important. So I think, again, there is a conviction amongst at least a sector of Colombian society of the importance of this. And that was a huge help. About freedom, as in the stolen words of Isaac Newton, we stood in the backs of giants. So we already had a methodology that we used in Bogota in Embrace Dialogue encounters before that, which was a huge input. We just adapted a couple of things. That wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have a strong methodological guidance from the directives of Embrace Dialogue. We did have a huge space basically to commit mistakes and learn from them, which was very important on a personal level. I certainly believe that one of the most important things on the project was being able to be mistaken and to err in many ways. We did have a guidance. We had lots of guidance, starting with you again, with Andre. We did have lots of support to assemble many things. But we also defended a lot our autonomy and the need for this to be a youth project. we limited the age of entrance. Every year we moved the age of entrance 1 year up, but we did limit the age of entrance to the events because we believed that it really had to be a place where young people could speak about these issues. And that if it was a young space, a youth space, that was filled with people, not only of other ages, but also of other interests, of more academic interest, of activist interest, of partidist political interest, then we wouldn't have that space to speak about the things we felt were important to speak about. So in that way, we did defend a lot our autonomy. We had the generosity of the directives of Embrace Dialogue, who we ignored, and then realized that what they said was absolutely brilliant after we had ignored them and committed mistakes. And that was very important. I think that even more important than the encounters itself or the publication of the book has been the chance to actually engage with the reality for a group of us who now are determined to continue doing this for the rest of our lives.
That's fantastic, Camilo. And I do have to say, being so close to this project, that it was absolutely marvelous to see your drive, the drive of all the members of Oriana, of the rest of the people, to see how you took responsibility for it, how you believe in yourselves, your independence, your creativity, your belief in the project was absolutely fundamental. And I do have to say that is very impressive. I don't know if any other case in which a group of, and you will correct me, of young people age 17 to 21 have already published a book that is really written by them, of course, with some editorial reviews, but written by them at this moment, explaining and condensing the experiences of meeting these people who you have mentioned, who are former combatants, victims, and peace builders. So why don't you now tell us a bit more about what is in the book? Can you, for example, tell us what did you learn or what is in the book about your encounters with former combatants?
Okay, so the first thing to say about the book was that it was a collective creation. It was really collective. All of the essays were written by a number of us. None of them were written by one of us alone. All of the essays, before they were written, were discussed by all of us. And of course, all of the essays came with the reflections of the 150 people who had participated in the events. About former combatants, one of the very interesting things that happened was that we had the chance to meet just before the pandemic started in February 2020 with two former paramilitary, one from the northern part of the country, from the Caribbean coast, one from the border with Venezuela. And we were always very, very scared of paramilitarism. Some of our families had been affected by paramilitarism, even one of them from more or less those areas near the borders with Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken. So we met with them, and when we started to write the book, one of the things we noted was they were victimized. One of them family there was a massacre in his family from the guerrilla, and they decided to take arms against the guerrilla. They decided to create auto-defense groups that later turned into huge paramilitary structures that massacred, that committed horrible acts in the Caribbean coast. And then investigating, we found that one of the victims of those massacres that this first person we met had committed had later joined a guerrilla. And so there was an absolute cycle of victims feeling that the state did not protect them, that nobody would protect them, that they had to protect themselves, and while doing that, had decided to take arms themselves. And it is this vicious cycle where this happens all the time. And then looking at other stories, we notice that that had happened. Well, that is the origin of paramilitarism in Colombia. That's the myth of paramilitarism. But then also talking to former guerrilla members, to the heads of the guerrillas, many of them had that experience too. They had been persecuted by the state while being students, or they had been a part of state violence and had decided to take arms. So one of the things we notice, what we have to break this cycle. If we don't break the cycle, then we are condemned to eternal violence, because every time a victim decides to take arms, he or she creates other victims.
In a country in which the armed actors have been dehumanized, it's really important what you are telling us. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in many of the post-conflict societies, and is that to understand that the categories of victims and victimizers, of perpetrators, are not black and white. That is a really simplification to think that human beings are only perpetrators, but precisely that link that you are making with the past and what puts them in those positions sometimes is absolutely fundamental to reflect about reconciliation in post-conflict societies. But then let's turn to the victims. I mean, you also said that you met with many victims of, like the people who you mainly understood as victims, of course, because they came to you because they had a tremendous tragedy behind. What did you learn from them? And can you share one or two of the anecdotes that you have of meeting with them they are part of the book?
Great. So the first thing about that is that, well, again, we're now working on other stuff, and amidst that other stuff, we met with another former paramilitary, and he said that there was one main difference between him and his victims. That was that he decided to take arms and they decided to forgive, and that is hugely important. You cannot force the victims into forgiving or reconciling. They already put their toll. They already paid their absolutely unjust price in this war, and they have. I certainly believe they have all the right to hate. They have all the right to be angry and to have sorrow. However, they have been the ones who. They have been the ones who have led the process of reconciliation in Colombia. They have been the ones who went to the Havana to search for the guerrilla and to work with them. They were the ones who went to the jails in Itagüí and other places of Colombia to search for the paramilitary and forgive them. So, talking about reconciliation and how this project made reconciliation my passion amongst this huge world that is peace building, there is one story that I want to emphasize on. This paramilitary, one paramilitary, lost, and this is not in the book, because if you want to, those that are in the book, you can buy the book and read them from there. But one paramilitary who lost both his parents to the guerrilla takes arms and disappears the three children, or at least one of the three children, of a woman, imagine. This woman, the three sons, three male sons she had, were either killed or disappeared by the paramilitary. So this woman goes to the prison in Itagüí. At first, she wants to go to the prison in Itagüí in order to search for truth. She hasn't found, and she still hasn't found, two of the children that have been disappeared. So she starts going and talking to this person who is her victimary. and realizes that this person is absolutely alone. The family that wasn't killed of this paramilitary man in war had deserted him after the peace process, after the disarmament process. So this man was absolutely alone with no family, and she was absolutely alone with no family because war had killed his sons. So this woman decides that if this man doesn't have a mother and she doesn't have sons anymore, the natural way to build a better future for both of us is for her to become his mother and for him to become her son. And of course, that is an absolutely radical and very creative example. Of course, not all of the stories are that way, but it shows how the victims, and there are many more, I could stay here hours and hours speaking about examples of how the victims have been the ones who have led Colombia towards peace. And the victims are the ones who raise their hand every time a tragedy comes again and again and again in post-agreement society to say, this is unacceptable. The Colombian people cannot continue accepting this sort of violence. We lived 30 years ago and other people are living still.
Camilo, you also met with peace builders. You met with people who were not on the, let's say, both spectrums that are usually looked at in reconciliation, that is the wrongdoer and the victim. So you met people who have been working on this for many years in your project. What did you learn from them? What can you share with us in terms of those encounters with these people, and why were these meetings with them important?
I'm not sure if you remember that conversation, but actually getting to that term peace builders was very difficult because we wanted to speak to lots of people. We wanted to speak to human rights defenders. We wanted to speak to negotiators. We wanted to speak to activists of some sort, or people who are working today in reincorporation, in transitional justice, and all that sort of stuff. And then we got to this idea of peace builders, which is a huge, huge concept. One of the things we learned was that every person we spoke to, victims, former combatants, and none of the above, were peace builders. Another thing we learned was that we were peace builders, and that we weren't only peace builders while we were meeting in the space, but that peace building is a lifestyle in a war-torn society like ours. But from those who, from this list of activists, human rights defenders, and negotiators, basically, what we learned was that the efforts of building peace in society didn't start in 2016 with the signing of the peace agreement with FARC. Colombia has had peace building basically as long as it has had war. And it has had people who have given their lives with huge sacrifice, who've had to exile at times, who have to go around the different cities of Colombia with armed bodyguards and armored vehicles, just because they have believed in a peaceful Colombia for many years. And again, that we stand in the backs of giants every time, that we are not Adam and Eve, and that these people that have been building a peace from the government of Belisario Betancourt in the 80s, that founded the big civil society organizations that still work for peace in Colombia, like Red de Paz, like La Ruta de Mujeres por La Ruta Pacífica de las Mujeres, all that sort of organization, that we have lots to learn from them, and that we cannot just dismiss intergenerational dialogue and say that they are outdated or that they had their time or that they failed. That we certainly cannot say that they failed because we are still in war, because all of this is building, as Tanya Passelhoff said in this space. It is perpetual peace building. We are all the time, and we have to learn from what other people did before us. So that is absolutely essential to this conversation.
I mean, and I remember all your ambitions and all the ideas that you had of so many people you wanted to meet, as you rightly said, and so many people you want to learn from. So how do you come to terms at the end having to choose? What was the criteria to choose the 30 people you definitely had to meet? You know, what was it that said, okay, this is it, and now actually we need to stop. Now we need to sort of do an analysis of what we have heard. We need to write about these stories. You know, how did you pick and choose?
I am a terrible person to answer that question. If it were my choice, we would be doing this till we were 90. And then it had to come a point where it was not my choice for somebody else to say, this is absolutely absurd. And we have to get to writing and closing this. The first thing we did was try to show a big picture about the conflict. In such a long conflict, so many things have happened that it's very, very difficult to be representative of everything that happened. I'm sure we weren't representative of everything that happened, but we tried to. We tried to bring victims of state violence and paramilitary violence, victims of guerrillas. We tried to show a bit of the violent repertoire that Colombia has lived through: forced disappearance, forced displacement, kidnapping, sexual violence, a genocide against the Communist Party, exile. We tried to show all of that regarding the victims. We had huge support from the people of the Truth Commission in order to help us get a grip on everything not everything again, but on many things that happened, and for them to tell us, well, you should talk about these topics. For example, the topics of sexual violence and exile were very influenced. Like the idea of bringing victims of sexual violence and exile were very influenced by conversations with the staff of the Truth Commission. Regarding the former combatants, we tried to bring at least one from every part. Some were more difficult than others. I think that our side of civil society organizations has become very close to the Communist Party, and so they always answered the phone, and it was very easy to bring them. And we brought 3 of them during the process. But for example, bringing a military, former or active, or anything.
What is the Communist Party? Could you just?
Sorry. The Communist Party is the party that was created from the FARC guerrilla in 2017 after their disarming process. So that was very easy, but bringing military people was very difficult, particularly bringing military that hadn't fighted with the armed forces. We were able to bring a former colonel who had a massive public fight around a very important human rights case. But then when we try to bring the people who are responsible, even those who are in the transitional justice system, to find even the contact for the people who are responsible for crimes against humanity, which hadn't been an issue, talking to the former guerrilla, that was very difficult. And then with peace builders, at the end, we didn't bring as many peace builders as we expected, as we initially wanted to. But we at least tried to have some human rights defender. We tried and then never achieved to bring some negotiators, and then also working with people who worked in reintegration processes. That was basically the way. But it was very difficult, and I still have a list of 90 people I would have liked to bring.
Thanks, Camilo. That's great. And I actually asked you that question because it was suggested in the YouTube chat. So at this moment, I would like to ask anyone who is either watching this on the live streaming or here to drop their questions in the chat box so that I can read them aloud and pose them to Camilo, so that we have this great opportunity for answer questions to anyone who is watching this live in this moment. And I have one here, Camilo, that is also being just sent that I would like to pose to you. And Natalia says, how this experience has changed your perspective on the way history is taught at school and other academic environments, and how it can contribute to understand the upcoming report of the Truth Commission. And how do you think this experience could help us to process all this information as a society?
So I must admit, I was very lucky with my history teacher about my Colombian history teacher at high school. She was a deeply committed woman with our nation's recent history, being frequently stigmatized for it. So when I came into the project, many of the things she had taught me, I thought that everybody knows them, right? Everybody knows that the paramilitary incursion in 1999 up to 2001 in Montes de Maria in the Caribbean region was absolutely horrendous. And everybody knows about the peace process from 1998 to 2002 and all that sort of stuff that I had learned in her class. And when I come to speak to the people who are working with me, who have a sensitivity for these things, they were just getting a grip on the existence of slavery. They were just getting a grip on the way that indigenous people were organized during the colonial period. So I certainly believe that this changes a lot my way of understanding history, of understanding the way it has to be taught, and I certainly believe that history is not only a tool in order to be able to sing the anthem and understand it, but it has to be a tool for critical thinking. It has to be a tool for doubt all the time about understanding different versions of history, understanding that history is not monolithic, and that the versions of what happened in the past are not just one, that there's no right to have an official history. So I certainly believe that that we have to change, and I really hope Embrace Dialogue has been working with teachers in another project in order to create tools for them to be able to teach the report of the Truth Commission. But I also believe that in such a polarized environment, in a politically fractured society, it will be very difficult, because we are not learning history from our history teachers, but by the ideologically charged discourses of politicians, of our families, of TV. The surge in narco television in Colombia has been very, very damaging to actually understanding history and complexity. So I think it's a huge challenge, and the question I don't have an answer for except for bubbling some free thoughts on, but I think it's absolutely crucial.
Camilo, what is your definition of reconciliation? And I want to ask you that so that I can also follow up with some questions about that, because you had mentioned the word reconciliation and how somehow what you've been doing contributes to reconciliation. So how do you understand reconciliation?
I was really hoping for the oral exam question on reconciliation. I had been preparing that answer for many days now. There are many ways to see reconciliation, and I think that there are or I would like to make some points on that. The first is the idea that all peace building is reconciliation. So that reconciliation is building roads, reconciliation is the transitional justice system, reconciliation is everything, basically. No? It's political participation, it's coexistence, and I'm not really engaged with that idea of this maximalized reconciliation, because I believe that it puts us in a place where reconciliation is definitely impossible. If reconciliation means that we have to fix the problems of the country, well, that will not happen. So that's one thing. Then there's this very, very minimal idea of reconciliation based in coexistence, in being free of armed violence or direct violence, which I believe is also very complex because it makes the amazing stories I've been telling you about just not seem quite important. For me, the main thing on reconciliation is the rebuilding or the building of relationships that were broken during the armed conflict. That is for me the main point of reconciliation, the rebuilding of relationships.
If that's the case, would you say that your project contributes to that? Because in a way, what I see is that you, a group of young people who were not victims of the conflict, met with some former combatants, met with some victims, but the fracture between the victims and the former combatants wasn't solved. So to what extent would you say that you learned that there was a contribution to reconciliation? Or is there something that happened behind the scenes that we don't know that really allow other things that are not on the book to happen, and that you could say, you know, we contributed a little drop in an ocean of reconciliation in Colombia?
Okay, so first I will go to the idea of whether or not we contributed, and then I'll make you a question before I get to my anecdote. Daniel Picot, a sociologist, talks about a war against society. And I'd rather believe that more than a war against society, it has been a war in society. One of the people who were kidnapped for 6 years sued the nation for 1,000 million pesos. That's like, at the time, was maybe $500,000. Because she believed that the state had not guaranteed her right to freely move safely throughout the nation, and that by denying her the special protection she required to go to a guerrilla-dominated area, they had vulnerated her rights. Today, 10 years later, that's the basis of reparations, and we have a reparation system. But at the time, she was called a traitor. They said she had Stockholm syndrome. The vice president said that she was nationless and ungrateful because she believed the state had a responsibility on what happened to her. The victims of a massacre in 2000, when they went from the village they lived in to the town, weren't received anywhere, and nobody would give them food the day they arrived, because everybody said that if they had been massacred, it was because they were guerrilla. The idea that only the perpetrators who shot weapons at other human beings are responsible of this conflict is really simplistic and tries to get rid of our own responsibility. We, as part of the society, rebuild relations with the victims by telling them, we believe you. We take your story at face value, and believe it because you are telling it to us. And because when you mention the name of your husband or your son or your father, you weep. And we understand that your pain is real. And that's something that Colombian society is learning to do, that the Truth Commission is teaching us to do, but that the Colombian society didn't do before, that the Colombian society still doesn't do. After a massacre today, a year ago, in which the police killed 13 people in Bogota, the stories of how these 13 people were drug addicts or were linked to the guerrilla or were bad human beings in any ways just flooded social media. And so we didn't understand. So it's still very difficult to understand or to make our society understand that life is sacred, that you cannot kill a person because you believe that person is dangerous to you. That's not the way that a civilized society works. So I believe our main contribution as a project to reconciliation was taking the stories and telling them, we believe you. We know that what you're saying is true, and that you are victims of this horrible violence and not perpetrators. Now, Andre, do you believe in magic?
Why? Sort of.
Great.
The magic that the youth do, I believe in that one. So now show me the trick.
Perfect. So one of the things I noticed was that reconciliation requires the possibility to make real something that is impossible. So I was talking to you about the case of the mother and the child who had lost their children and their mothers. Of course, you cannot, without magic, replace your parents or your children. There's another anecdote that we do tell in the book of not naming names in order not to make people lose, but of a huge paramilitary member. He passed 12 years in prison and then went to an event where there were guerrilla. And in this event, he said, when I was in the war, I believed that you and I could not fit in the same space of 1.1 million square kilometers. But now that we're sharing a stage of 70 square meters, I realize we do. In order to reconcile relationships, to rebuild relationships, you have to believe in magic. You have to believe that what's impossible can be real or will be real eventually. And so I'll tell one anecdote. We met with the victim, one of the people we worked with, one of our main collaborators in this project is the daughter of a commander, of a former guerrilla commander. An amazing person, absolutely amazing person. And we were going to speak to a victim of kidnapping, a woman whose husband was kidnapped and 3 years later was killed by the guerrilla. So I offered the idea of moderating this woman to the group, as I always do, in order to keep the moderation rotating. And she said, I want to do it. So that was surprising. And as this woman tells her story, she starts noticing that she would like, and as other people also start telling their story, she notices that she would like to tell her story too. And part of that story of this woman was her daughter, the daughter of this woman and the kidnapped assemblyman. And this daughter was born in the same year as our friend was. So at the end, the meeting ended. She didn't feel quite comfortable to tell the story there, but she decided that she would really like to talk to this other girl who was the same age as she was, who had also lived war in a very different way, but throughout the same period. And so this story doesn't have an ending yet. They did meet one time. They spoke about many things, about projects that they would like to do together. They haven't gotten yet to talking about their stories. And I'll be sure to tell you whenever they do. But one of the things I've noticed in this person, in Laura, my friend, our collaborator, is that she certainly believes in magic. She believes that she can meet with someone she would have never met before, and that it will be fine. And that has been a huge inspiration again, as to how we have joined people. Of course, I was telling you about the diversity and about the way we've joined people that wouldn't meet in clubs and parks around the city, but also about how we have been able to join people who were divided by war, whose relationships were destroyed by war. And of course, many times we don't have the massive hug that one would expect from the photos of the South African Truth Commission, but we have a bit of magic that doesn't make the whole trick, but that puts us on our way.
Great, Camilo. Great, Camilo. And guess you are reconcilers now at a very young age. So I think, to start wrapping up, I would like to ask you two questions. The first one has to do with why do you think it is important, the work that a group of teenagers is doing for reconciliation? Why is it important? Is it more important than the work that people who are 50, 60, 70 are doing? Or not to put it in sort of in those levels, but could we have reconciliation in a post-conflict society if the young people do not engage in the process of reconciliation?
First of all, I want to put some doubt about the idea of reconciliation in a post-conflict society. This process has also made me very realist in the sense that we can get to agreements of coexistence. We can get to an agreement about the rejection of the use of direct violence as part of our political life. But I've become very, very skeptic about the idea of a whole society reconciliating. I certainly believe that, and when looking at the cases of Spain, of Chile, of Argentina, even of South Africa, you find that you will always have people who think that the war was just, or that the victims deserved what they had. You will always find negationism. So I don't believe in the idea of the whole society reconciliating. However, I do believe that that youth has a very important part in again in generating magic. Father Theroux, in the book he wrote about a year before he was named to the Truth Commission, says that Colombia requires a leadership that is only interested in peace, that is not interested in being elected to public post, that isn't interested in winning the war, that isn't interested in establishing an official story about the past. He mentions the church, and he says that not only the Catholic Church, but churches, inter-ecclesiastical leadership has brought that sort of moral leadership to the Colombian society. I believe that young people do also have that capacity of leadership. I think that this idea of we are trying, and this narrative of we are trying to build a future for everyone is very important. And I believe that's why we've been able to have yes all around when we invite all sorts of guests to our meetings, because they understand that we are trying to build a future for everyone. Not only for the people who have been our friends during war. And I believe that there is one, sadly, Colombia hasn't been able to rid itself of war, but there is a huge moral tool in saying we didn't live the war. We didn't live most of it. What we lived while we were children. So we don't care about the narratives of, we're not interested in putting forward the narratives of our parents. We want to build a narrative that includes all of us, understanding, of course, that the narrative will never include all of us, but we are at least trying. And I think that is a very important message that we have tried to send and that people have told us we are sending to the Colombian society.
Camilo, there is another question coming from YouTube. So I'm gonna leave my final question for later, because if we have questions coming up, then I think we should give priority to the questions. And we, as we said, we have an hour and a half. So the idea is that if more questions coming up from Zoom or from YouTube, we take them insofar as they are within the time limit. So this question is from Marcela. And Marcela is asking you, how can your experience how can your experience be used to prevent conflict in the future?
So one of the things that I was talking about prior. No, let me take it from another point. One of my favorite poets, which I learned from when I was 14 and I went to London, is Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen fought the First World War and wrote a very important poems. He was one of a number of poets, soldier poets, about how useless the war is. And one of his very famous phrases is, the great lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. His great message was that war is a waste. And he was killed in action maybe 2 weeks before the armistice. I think that is a message that youth all around the world has to send. We have to be radically pacifist. We have to be absolutely non-conformist with wars. We have to believe that no war, not here in Somalia, in Afghanistan, is just or justified or can be used for anything. So I certainly believe that that radically pacifist narrative is very important, not to prevent conflict, to prevent violence. Another thing that I've learned from this very Colombian context is that the problem is not conflict. The problem is not that different parties have different ideas about the future and will not be able to agree on them. That's democratic and that's good. The problem is when the different ideas about the future become reasons to kill each other. And that is what I believe that is very, very difficult. So the main message we have to send as a generation is, whatever our differences are, whatever we think about each other or about each other's ideas, we can never go back to eliminating each other in order to solve our political controversies.
Thank you, Camilo. Okay, my final question, so that we can wrap up now, has to do with the book again. So what are the next steps? We all know that, a book which is not widely read is a book that doesn't exist. So what are you, the group, the authors, the co-authors of this group, going to do in order to use this book as a reconciliation tool, in order to spread this message that you are talking about? Are you planning some events? Is the book in English? or is the book in Spanish? How can people get the book? Why don't you finish this final part of this dialogue, telling us a bit more about where people can find that book and what are the plans of Red Youth for spreading the word?
Okay, so after you book me at Piers Morgan's show, or I don't know where other late night show to talk about the book, there are a number of things to be done. Of course, we have a number of events. Next week, we have an event with a private business where some colleagues will talk about the book, other of the co-authors. We do have planned a big event to launch the book, which doesn't have a date now. And we hope to have all the co-authors at that time. And we also have to give the book to the Truth Commission. So that is about formally the events we will do regarding the book. All of the book's work, it comes down to the last 3 pages. And if you're going to buy the book, you can basically start by reading those 3 pages that are the manifesto. All of the rest of the book is just the food for the manifesto. And that is where we put our stance on the future of Colombia, on a future, of course, without war, but with social justice and environmental justice, without that horrible racism and that absolutely horrible misogyny that we still have in our society, in which we can root out the structural violences of our society, not only the direct violence. So that's our manifesto. That's the main part of the book, and that I'm sure will be the tool we will be using more often in the following years. And then comes the report of the Truth Commission. We believe, and we are talking a lot about, how can we transform truth into memory? I think that history tells us that truth isn't necessarily memory. You can build memories from lies. And so this report, which is, as the people in the commission say, not the end point, but the beginning point of the search for truth in our country, it will be our key tool in the future in order to continue talking to victims and former combatants and peace builders, in order to talk to young people and convert them into peace builders, in order to start creating a new narrative about what we Colombians are, that is not permeated by drug trafficking, by war, by misogyny, by racism, but rather by a new way of looking at our diversity, at our conflicts, at our politics, at our history. So that's basically what comes next.
Camilo, that's great. Thank you so much. Let me offer some thoughts to wrap up this incredible space with you. I'm really delighted to have had you in this 4 dialogue on reconciliation. It fits perfect in this series that we have been doing. We started the first dialogue with Rodi Brett, talking about failed reconciliation, in particular in Guatemala. Then we moved to talk with Berta Fries about her encounters for reconciliation that she did and she has been doing in Colombia at different levels. Berta, who is a former victim, a victim of the FARC. Then we moved to talk to Tanya Pfaffenholz to talk about perpetual peace building and the connection with reconciliation, and you have mentioned her, and the need of inclusive peace building. And now we have you talking about the role of the youth in reconciliation. And I really believe that you have shown us today that Graham Simpson was right when he wrote the report for the United Nations, saying that the missing piece of peace building was that the youth were not taken seriously. You have shown us that by believing in you, step by step, we can help a divided society to try to journey toward reconciliation. to travel toward reconciliation, as John Paul Lederach says. I think that, Camilo, you have shown us that you have now, after some years of working, of meeting with former combatants, with victims, with peace builders, you have somehow created a first tool to try to contribute to reconciliation in Colombia. A journey that you are starting and that probably you are not gonna be alive to see it fulfilled. Probably no one is gonna be ever alive. Reconciliation is a journey, an aspiration to reach a place that is never 100% reached, as you mentioned. But this tool that you have to work for it is really powerful. And you have shared with us that that tool has a manifesto that you are going to try to share with other young people like you in schools, in universities, so that they can start seeing that they play a fundamental role in stopping the recycling of violence in Colombia. And this is absolutely fundamental for us, the people working and researching on reconciliation. Because if there is something that we know, is that the main problem for reconciliation is intergenerational violence. Is that usually the next generations continue to be trapped in the old ways of dividing societies, of us and them. And for that reason, I deeply believe that the contribution that you are making is far more important than the contribution than older generations do. Because you are now stopping something that is coming behind you. And that's absolutely powerful. You have a long way to continue working on this. And the final thing that I would like to say is that you have inspired us. You have mentioned that in order to work on reconciliation, we have to believe in magic. And I think that's a powerful, powerful way of looking at it. But the most amazing thing, Camilo, is that you guys in this project don't think about magic as in a naive way. On the contrary, you are critical thinkers. You know that the magic comes from understanding that the impossible sometimes is possible. And the only way it's going to become a possibility is working for it. So thank you so much. You have really given us lots of food for thought. And we leave this meeting thinking that there is hope for the future and many reasons to continue working for reconciliation. So on behalf of the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester and of Embrace Dialogue of the organization of which I'm also part of, I really want to say congratulations to you, to Oriana, and to all the members of Red Youth for doing this for Colombia. And thank you so much for joining us.